Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philadelphia. I am your host, Caleb Watt, here with my fantastic co-host, Pastor Doug, as usual. Pete, Doug, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Caleb. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. I think yesterday I felt like a little bit happier than usual, and so today I'm like, riveting topics to talk about.
Yeah, and hopefully there's some holy laughter that comes out of it.
A holy laughter, a deep, abiding holy laughter from the Spirit himself. So, what are we talking about today, Pastor Doug?
Yes, so recently I preached a message from Mark chapter 2, where we see the story of these four men. They carry their friend who is a paralytic to Jesus, but Jesus is at home in Capernaum preaching, and his house is packed because crowds have swarmed in. They're trying to listen to Jesus. And so these men who are carrying their friend can't get in. And so they climb up on top of the house, burst through the roof, and they lower their friend to the feet of Jesus. And Jesus, when he sees this, he says, when he sees their faith, he says when he sees the faith of the friends, he tells the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, which obviously riled up the Pharisees, or the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees there, who else can forgive sins but God alone? But obviously Jesus is God, so he can forgive sins. But in order to show the people who he really is, he then raises, the man, he heals the man, and he's able to walk again. He's like, which is easier, doing this, healing this, or forgiving sins? And he's trying to say, this is actually easier, healing this man. What's harder is forgiving the sins. But what I want to focus on a little bit more, today in this talk is this idea of accountability, because one of the things I talked about in my message was how these friends, they took accountability for their paralyzed friend to get to Jesus, because they knew that he wasn't going to get there on his own, right? He was paralyzed. There was no way he was getting to Jesus on his own. So they took accountability for him and brought him to the feet of Jesus. And I think that's a beautiful picture of accountability. Because we likewise, in our own friendships, right, spiritual friendships, we're meant to bring each other to Jesus, because there's spiritual paralysis in all of us. There's blind spots in our lives. We need others to help us to see those spots, to call us out, to rebuke us when necessary, and to lovingly spur us on so that we can keep growing. We are called to bring each other to Jesus, to bear one another's burdens, as it says elsewhere. And that's what accountability is. So I want to talk a little bit more about accountability, particularly from a more practical angle.
Practical angle. Yeah, because I think accountability is you're right, bear one of those burdens. But there's I feel, right, and maybe this is where I'm starting with the conversation, right, based on what you said and also what you said in the sermon. It's there's a certain degree to which that I felt in my life that I can be present to someone, almost point to, hey, there's Jesus, go there, right? And there's another maybe level where I can take them by the hand and walk with them towards Jesus, or maybe even pull them a little. But I have felt and found that carrying someone to Jesus is either immensely difficult or in some sense impossible, right? So I think that's where I want to begin with the discussion for myself, right? I don't necessarily know entirely where you want to go yet, but what's it mean to bring someone to Jesus, right? Because there's an element of if someone doesn't want to come to Jesus, they're never going to come to Jesus, right? And I'm saying that for someone who's saved and not saved, right? Because as Christians, there's a lot of times where maybe this is the paralysis, part of the paralysis that you're talking about, right? It's I just don't want God in that part of my life, right? And that's wrong, but that's just the functionality and reality of who I am. So how does someone bring me to Jesus in the midst of something like that, and what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, one, obviously, it's best done in a group. These are four men that did it for their friend. If it was just one person, I don't know if they would have made it to Jesus, right? I don't think they would have been able to pull him up onto the roof, right? And then lower him down. They would have dropped him through the roof.
They're very strong men.
Because obviously it's better in groups, not just a one-on-one type of scenario. But ultimately, think about the motivation for these men. It was love. It was love that compelled them to bring their friend. There was no reason why they needed to. Or maybe there is. I mean, we don't know, obviously, the backstory. Maybe there's an origin story of sorts here. But I I like to think that it was probably love. They had deep love for their friend. And so they were willing to say, like, hey, let's come together and let's bring our friend to Jesus. And when I think about like our own, sake of like, if we know someone who's really going through a rough time, we're not dragging them to church, kicking or screaming or something like that, but we're loving them. And we are gently reminding them of who Jesus is. And maybe have to be a little more than gentle, right? In Hebrews 10, it says we should spur one another along. And that spurring sort of evokes the idea of like spurring a horse to like go faster, not to get into the whole like animal cruelty of it all. But there's sometimes a little poking and prodding that we need to do to one another. But it has to start from a heart of love. And I think that's what's key when we think about this. Like, do we actually love that person? Because if that person can see your love, even if you do have to like poke them a bit, if they can see the love, hopefully that can like snap them out of it and wake them up a bit.
Okay, I have other thoughts, right, that are perhaps a little bit more abstract. But for the sake of moving it into the tangible and the practical, because I think that's what you said, what the purpose of this, and we will touch on the abstract things later. What do you feel is like a good system for accountability?
Yeah, right. That's a great question because I know a lot of people want it. I heard from people after this message, like connection cards, things like that, people mentioning things like, oh, like I've tried it, feels like it's not like reciprocated, I've tried being like vulnerable with others and it feels like it just doesn't work. And I want to like acknowledge that, yeah, it's not easy. And I know some people really want it, are desperate, and you feel probably like hurt by others. Like, hey, how come like I'm trying this, but other people like like this other brother I've been trying to like have this like accountability with, but they're not like showing the same interest in it. It feels like I'm just it's like one way. I'm just sharing, not sharing anything. And I know that's painful, and I just want to acknowledge that that it hurts when that way. But I think we got to realize that this takes more than just the right intentions. There has to be follow through and a greater intentionality. Right? We want to have good intentions, but we want there to be intentionality with how we go about accountability. Because if you think about these 4 men in the story in Mark, they probably had to like talk to each other about this. There's probably some level of planning that was necessary because obviously 4 different people having like to show up and pick up their friend. There was some level of intentionality. Like maybe they even said before, like, hey, if Jesus comes, we're grabbing our friend. Like there was some system in place. And so if we want to do accountability with someone, it's not a matter of saying, hey, let me share my feelings and thoughts and you then share yours and pray for each other. There needs to be a system. And so I always encourage people, if we want to start an accountability group, don't just say, hey, like meet up with me. Say, hey, no, we're going to do this. Like, let's grab 3 or 4 people. We're going to meet on Monday nights and we're going to like eat, pizza or chicken wings or something. And we're going to talk and we're going to pray. Like, let's make this an actual thing and have a system in place, like a time, a place, a rhythm to it. Because if we try to do it in a one-off way, it's not going to stick. Maybe it will for a little bit. Maybe you'll do it like once, twice. But you need a system in place for it to actually last. And so if you're just saying, hey, I'm sharing my feelings with someone, but I'm not actually like trying to do something that's more like sustainable or like think through a process for doing it, it probably won't last. Because I think most people want something like this, but we just don't always have the motivation to keep going, especially when we treat it as like a one-off type of scenario. But what makes it easier for us to want to stick with it is when we have a process and a system in place. So, hey, Monday nights, let's, I'm just picking arbitrary time, right? Sunday nights, Monday nights, whatever. Like, let's meet at this time. We're going to come together. Like, maybe even have like a spreadsheet that you open. Like, the more tangible things you can have in place, the better chance it has of actually working out, right? It can't just be, hey, let's just talk because, and talk when we have time. That will not last. There needs to be intentionality. There needs to be a system. And it sounds kind of weird. It sounds like difficult, but if you really value it, you'll be willing to put in the work because nothing of value comes of its own, really necessarily. Like you had to put in work to it. Our Christian growth requires us to take ownership, to put in effort for it to grow. Obviously, the effort isn't about earning grace, but there's effort it takes to grow. Right. And we need to be willing to put in that if we really want to grow in this area of accountability.
Sounds like James Clear's Atomic Habits.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I think it's part of it. Yeah, that fits in.
Yeah, it's like the intentionality of like setting the system, I think, especially is what gets me. Because like one of the quotes from the book is, that I think people quote all the time and then not read the book because it's that good, right? It's like you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And I'm like, like something like this, right? It's like the goal is lofty. It's like I want accountability. I want like that sort of relationship. But like if I don't set the system in place, then I fall to whatever the default is, right? So I like that. So then my next question is like, what's the difference then between accountability and like just friendship, right? Because I can meet with a friend every week. I can hang out with a friend every week. But accountability implies something like deeper, right? Or maybe not deeper, but like functionally different, right? Because I can have a very close friend that I see every week, but like not necessarily have them as a accountability partner.
Yeah.
Right. So what's the difference and why? Like, yeah, I guess like what's the functional difference?
Well, I mean, I thought a lot of it just comes down to semantics.
You're a big semantics guy, Peter.
I always want to say like you're not a true friend unless you actually have accountability. Like, otherwise, you're just more of like acquaintances or like you're just buddies.
But I mean, like in the sense that it's like I feel like what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm not picking up what you're putting down, P-Doug. But it's like there's almost like a sense in which like I'm getting in my mind, right? Like in Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline, when he talks about the discipline of confession, which I think is related to accountability, right?
For sure.
He's like very specifically, intentionally seeking out a specific person, right? That he feels like God is laying up on his heart or something like that. And then he'll talk to that person, is like, hey, I'll confess these things and can you pray for me, right? And then that might develop into accountability. I think he does mention that in the book. So to me, in my head, right, even in times past, right, is like with my friends, I'm willing to open up, discuss, be vulnerable. But there are other times where it's like I have sought out somebody who's not as close of a friend to be like, hey, do you want to be accountability partners, right? And so it feels like there's a slightly different dynamic than just being like friends. I don't know if this is like the experience for everyone, right? But this is how I've experienced it in the past.
I don't think all. So I mean, I mentioned. Like, I don't think it's wrong to have like, I'm just using this term, like buddies, right?
Sure.
People we hang out with because we need that in our lives. And I'm not saying everything has to be super serious and like we're always sharing our sins no matter what we're doing, right? No, you can like hang out and, you know, just have fun sometimes. But we do need at least a relationship or a couple relationships where we do have that spurring that's happening, you know, that's occurring. And that requires intentionality. Having buddies doesn't require intentionality. You hang out when you're free. Like, hey, are you free? You're free? Hey, let's go hang out. Let's like, you know, play games together or something, you know? But to have accountability, that requires intentionality and planning and requires like there'd be, you know, a real, like there's a real sense of like pre-planning it and making sure it's like something that's scheduled in to our lives. And I think we all need that. But I'm not saying that it needs to like, you know, we need to make all our buddies then be these like accountability partners or all our accountability partners to be our buddies. Like they don't have to necessarily overlap. But our accountability partners are someone we trust, someone that knows us well, who can ask hard questions if they can tell that we're sort of skirting around an issue, right? You know, so it has to be someone who knows us because otherwise, like, you know, they only know as much as we're sharing. And hopefully this is someone that could see our blind spots as well.
That brought up another question. I know we want to, the next question that I originally wanted to ask was like practically structuring like one of these meetings, but your statement brought to mind, spurred within my mind, dare I say, another question, which is, I feel like, and I think I've mentioned this before in one other episode, and we discussed it briefly, but I forget which one it was. But it's like, I feel like a lot of times people are comfortable sharing with a pastor or someone who they view as like more mature or ahead of them in faith, rather than someone who's like a friend, right? So how do you view something like that, right? Where I mean, first off, it sounds like that's a lot of work for one pastor, right? To have to counsel and be like, I don't necessarily even know if you would categorize that as accountability partner, because just realistically, you can't be an accountability partner for like however many people are in GCC, right? But it's like, how do you view something like that versus then like how does my thoughts are just so discombobulated. I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, one of the biggest reasons why a pastor can't be the accountability partner for another is because accountability, there should be some level of being in it together because you're going through similar things. Some of the most valuable accountability I've had is when I've talk to someone, I realize that we're actually struggling with similar issues, and therefore there is an innate desire in both of us to overcome those things. And so we're like, hey, let's actually do this because we see the value in it for each of us. And so actually, I think you can have seasons of different accountability because when you recognize that someone else is struggling with something similar, you can come together. And I think that becomes actually even more powerful than if you just like seek out like some random person who might not have any affinity towards like what you're or any sense of like what you're going through and isn't able to like understand in the same way. But again, it's hard though. It's hard to find that. But it's sort of like light. You can sometimes feel like lightning in a bottle. It's like you're talking to someone and then you realize, whoa, like you were going through something similar. Let's talk. But I think we need to be willing to recognize that, like, yeah, we need a peer level. We need a peer level accountability because peers can like go through things together with us, right? I can't be the accountability partner for everyone. Like we're in very different like life stages, seasons of life, you know. And I honestly, and I'm like, you know, I can care for you past you, and you can tell me what's going on in your life, and I'll pray for you, right? But there's not going to be the same level of like mutual accountability that can happen between peers, between like people who are actually real like friends.
Yeah, we're not peers, P-Dog.
Sorry, Caleb.
You were graduating college, but I was entering middle school.
All right, you know to bring that
up. So then that leads to, I guess, now the practical, like boots on the ground. Like, how does accountability look like within perhaps like a session, right? When you meet with someone, and then over like an extended period of time.
Yeah, I think there has to be agreed upon methodology of sorts. Or, sorry, this sounds so like professional or whatever.
A Gospel Fight Club.
Yeah,
wait, have you heard of Gospel Fight Club?
No, I have not. But I've heard of Fight Club, but never Gospel Fight Club.
It was presented to me.
Rule number one: we don't talk about Fight Club.
We don't talk about Gospel Fight Club. No, but it's like it's basically like some structure to like intentionality with like confession and stuff like that, and then prayer over each other, like and preaching of the gospel to one another, that sort of thing. Which is why they throw the gospel onto it. But anyways, that's what it made me think of. Because,
But no, I think, you know, you bringing up that makes a good point. Anything that you have like rules and like, you know, process methodology, it can, even though it can sound so like formal and like I don't know, it just feels like fake to it. It actually shows that you value it though, because you put rules, you put boundaries on the things that you actually like value. You set procedures on the things that like matter to you. And so I think like, you know, whatever accountability you go into with someone or a group of people, have an agreed upon way of doing it. And whether that be a set of questions that you will always answer. You know, for example, if you guys are struggling with the same sin every week, you're going to know, you're going to be asked a question. Did you fall into that sin that we're working through right now? Like that's, you know, that's a question you always ask. Like what happened? You know, why did that happen? So have like set questions that you know you're going to talk about. Maybe even have like a spreadsheet where you can report in during the week, like each day. Like, you know, if you're doing like a Bible reading accountability, like you got to check it off.
Right.
So have a system in place, have a way of tracking it. And then also I think as necessary is having like, it sounds silly, but like having reward and punishment system. Because again, this all shows the amount of care and valuing that you're putting on it. And so like, if say like you know, you're doing accountability system with people that, you know, maybe doing a Bible reading thing. If everyone does it, say for like that week, celebrate in some way. I've heard it said before, like things that are celebrated get repeated, right? Things that are celebrated get repeated. I think Andy Stanley said that, I believe. And so if you celebrate like the victories that you have in this accountability, there's going to be this great desire to like keep going and like you're going to enjoy it more. But on the flip side, you want to have like punishments because you want a reason why you're not going to do it. Obviously not like terrible things, but maybe if someone like, you know, doesn't do their Bible reading or someone like does something, you know, whatever that, you know, you say, hey, you have to buy dinner for the group next time, you know, like something like that. A little bit of like spurring.
A little bit of spurring.
And so that's what I'm saying. So have a system in place, right? Have a process, have a set time you're going to meet each week, have questions you're going to answer. Have a means of knowing, of like following up with people, like whether it be like through a spreadsheet or something, of like being able to track what you're doing. Have a system of like rewards, you know, and you want to celebrate the victories. So all this is to show, I mean, there isn't a prescription. I'm just trying to throw out like suggestions, but the heart of the matter is there needs to be a system, there needs to be intentionality behind it. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And so for those who've said, oh, I've tried this, like, have you tried going that far though? say, hey, I want to invite you into this accountability I'm doing. This is how we're going to do it. Let's do this together. Versus just saying, hey, I want to share with you my feelings, and if you respond well, then if this keeps going, that's great. Like, no, like, you got to go one step farther. We want to have like a full system in place.
How do you find people to do accountability with?
Mm-hmm.
Because what you're saying, right? It's like not only it sounds like, right, a little bit like, again, peers, right? So someone who's like in a similar life stage, or maybe can at least relate to what you're going through, and you can relate to them on the flip side. But it's also someone who also needs to have this desire and willingness to commit. So I'd imagine, and I've certainly felt for myself too, it's like, yeah, I can have these desires, and as you've said, right, like maybe I just go out and share my feelings with someone is like a one-off meeting, but like it's not just me who has to be willing to put it to work, right? The other person has to as well.
Yeah.
So how do I go and find those people who are willing to do accountability and do life with me?
I think actually, the way it might work is if you're in a family group, just ask a couple brothers, right? Or sorry, I'm as a brother, speaking of brothers, but if for the sisters, ask a couple of sisters, and say, hey, like I'm thinking about starting this. Would you like to join? Because that way, like you don't need everyone to, but you're giving everyone an option to join. And then personally, obviously, you want to personally ask them, right? Don't just say like, don't just like spam your family groups. Hey, I'm doing this thing, and want to do it, because that usually doesn't result. Like individually ask as well. Right. But have a group. Just say like, hey, like there's brothers in my family group, and I'm hoping to form accountability with. I'm just going to ask a couple of them, and maybe not all of them will say yes, but probably one of them will be interested.
Yeah.
Or if you're having a conversation with someone and you're recognizing that, hey, maybe like we might be struggling with some of things, to say like, I've had this thought, maybe we should do this accountability thing together. I think it's very possible, because just for the fact that I'm like hearing the same thing from a lot of people, there's a lot of people who want this. True, it's just they don't know how to actually like start it. And I'm saying it starts by having intentionality, setting a process. So I don't think most people have a hard time finding others to want to do it. It won't be everyone for sure. If you're expecting like all the brothers in your family group to do this together, that's probably not going to happen, nor is that good, right? You want the smaller the group, the better, right? I think three, two would sometimes be too small. I think 3 is like a good number, or even maybe 4 as well. But just ask a couple different people and say, hey, like I'm starting this thing. And I think you'll find that some people will be willing to join in.
So then how do you begin to get comfortable in that sort of space, sharing? Right? Because a lot of the things that you want to be held accountable for, right, could be like maybe more, I don't want to say benign, right, because Bible reading is anything, but right, it would be inaccurate to paint it in such a way, right? But it feels like something that's like, yeah, I'm being held accountable for Bible reading, versus like this is a deep sin pattern that I've been struggling with for a very long time, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, how do I get comfortable in such a setting to be able to share that, right? Especially when some of these things bring a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, especially if it's like habitual, right? It's a pattern. Like, some weeks you just don't feel like winning against sin. Some weeks you just don't feel like doing that thing, right? But you still have to show up, and it's like, how do I get over that sort of like feeling, right?
Yeah, I think it's just you're always gonna feel that feeling.
Yeah,
I think that's not on you then. At that point, it's like that's why I said having set questions in the accountability group that other people ask you. Like, and you have to answer honestly. Obviously, you could lie, but hopefully, that's not what we're doing. But I think that's why we need accountability, because we're not always going to want to share. So if we have this system in place, on those weeks where we like, I just didn't really feel like this. I didn't really, I like gave up a little bit. You still know that you're going to get asked that question by someone else, right? That's why the sharing shouldn't be like on you each week. It should be like come out of like the questions they're asked. And again, that goes back to like the ground rules. That goes back to the process. Right. Do you have these things in place that will say like how we're going to go about it? Like, have expectations, right, for this group. Expectations that we're going to have to answer these questions.
I like that system, so you can't run or hide.
Yeah.
So then, as someone who's like in the group, right, when someone shares, right, how do you exhort that brother or sister to continue fighting, continue pursuing God, right? Especially when they're sharing like very sensitive, like things about their life.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You love them. I think it goes back to what in the beginning. Ultimately, all this has to flow from a heart of love.
Mm.
And we're not doing this because we think we can fix ourselves. We're doing this because we want to bring each other to Jesus.
Mm.
And so when someone shares something, we want to comfort them with the truth of the gospel, the truth of like the freedom that we have in Jesus,
Mm.
The hope that we have in him, the forgiveness we have in him. And so, when someone shares and you can tell that like if they're hurting in some way, ultimately we're not there to give them ourselves. We're them to be Jesus to one another.
Mm.
And that's why like any system of accountability should also have prayer as part of it. We're going to love and encourage. We're going to pray for one another.
I actually really like that thought because I keep referencing a celebration of discipline, right, in these podcasts because it's one of the more recent books that I've read. But it also presented some new ideas, and like one of the thoughts I'm still like mulling over, right? I don't know how I entirely if I have an entirely cohesive thought about it, but again, in this chapter on confession, Foster brings up a point where it's like we can like it almost as you're saying, right? Like in that moment, the brother or sister that you're confessing to, they can almost like take on the role of Jesus in that they speak the truth into your life, right? They're not the ones forgiving your sins, right? They can't do that, right? They're just human. But they can say Christ's words of forgiveness to you, right? And this is, I think that's almost like paradigmatic for like what you're saying right now, right? Because it's like, yeah, I kind of what we're saying, you're all peers in a group, right? Like everyone's struggling.
Yeah.
Maybe even with the same thing. But like what empowers each person to be able to then encourage and spur, right, on other members of the group is the fact that there is a truth, right, that we can point back to, which is the whole truth and love with truth, like sort of paradigm, right? Then on the topic of accountability and finding people for accountability, and I ask this because it's like a real thought, right? For people of our demographic, accountability with people of the opposite sex, right? Do you think that's a bad idea, good idea? Especially when there's like a significant other type of
not recommend it, particularly if you're dating. Like your girlfriend, boyfriend should not be your accountability partner. That just sounds like a recipe for so many problems. It's like, I don't even think I need to explain that. I think most people understand that's a terrible idea. I think though a lot of people wonder though about friends though, right? If I have a friend who is of the opposite gender, is that a problem? And I would say it's not recommended because ultimately the struggles that we go through, we want to have someone who kind of goes through similar struggles. And, obviously there are various struggles that brothers go through, various struggles that sisters go through, very varied type of things. But you don't want to go into there with like misunderstanding of expectations, misconstrue things, or like misunderstand each other. Because the way we process things can be very different at times. And so I think it's just much healthier to stay with brothers as for brothers, sisters with sisters. It just voids a lot of the other like unspoken expectations that might come out of a relationship like that. It opens up too many emotional boundaries that, again, sometimes we don't process those well. Right. Particularly brothers. Like sometimes brothers, if a sister like opens up to emotionally, they automatically think that sister likes them. It's like, and then they're gonna like, that brother's gonna have a crush on the sister. And,
Yikes!
I joke that
Peter, I'm preaching truth today.
I joke that like if a sister just asks their brother, "How are you?" Brothers think that's like an invitation just to share like all their emotional like stuff, like unload it. But anyway. But no, I think these should be kept towards like brothers with brothers, sisters with sisters, for the sake of accountability, in this like deeper level of accountability.
Well, I think that's like about the end of my questions, right? I think it's like, it's very practical to say, hey, let's have a framework, right? But that's like then it's up to the people who are involved, right, in the group to come up with those agreed upon rules, stipulations, regulations, and stuff like that. I guess the last thought is like you've mentioned a few times already prayer, right? And I guess we can always take prayer as the general like exhortation of like just remember God, right? But like prayer and accountability group, right? How vital is it? Like how important is it? Why is it important, right? And how does it look, right?
Well, it's super vital because ultimately, again, like I said, we do accountability not because we're like offering ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
but we're offering like you said, like the truth, right?
Mm.
We speak the truth to one another in love, and it's through prayer that we recognize we need God's help in this,
Mm.
because we're not circling up to like just be together. We're circling up to be together under God. Right? That's what accountability is we're together with the Lord, and He's the only one that can really change us and move us and like transform us. And so we want to pray because otherwise it's like what we're doing is kind of pointless, right? It's just like, it's just all for show. But when we pray, like we're recognizing we need God's help, we need His power. That's why we gather, right? And even it says like where 2 or 3 are gathered in His name, like there He is among us. Like there's power in praying together and being together. And so like pray. Don't just like talk and like share. Like make prayer a critical cornerstone part of what you do in these times of accountability. But how it looks, I mean, I can't prescribe that. But I mean, I think pray for each person, right?
Sure.
Like especially if someone has a hard time, maybe you got to pause and say, hey, like this person's really having a rough time. Let's actually spend time praying and really listening, even for like the Lord. What does the Lord want to say to this brother or this sister who's hurting right now? But just make sure you carve out a significant time for prayer, because prayer is so key. It's like foundational to accountability.
I like the thought. I frequently find you're entirely correct, right? Like prayer is frequently like the relegated to the last thing that we do if we have time.
If you have time, I know, right? It's like, hey, like at the end of service or end of like FNL or something, turn to your neighbor and just like share and pray. And next thing I know, 20 minutes passed, no one started praying yet. Like, hey, the sharing should have been like no more than half the time, right?
It's like sometimes we feel like we have so much to say about ourselves that we don't take the time to listen to God, or maybe even to share it with God, right, in prayer. So I like that thought. It's like I remember reading one author, and it's like if we understood the power of prayer, we would pray so much more. And this is like kind of what it reminds me of too, right? Breaking chains, right, of slavery to sin, right? Especially in the context of accountability, but also empowering, right, to pursue a life after Christ, right?
Yeah.
So, anyways, do you have any concluding thoughts, Doug?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered that pretty thoroughly, and I'm just really hopeful that this actually happens, because accountability is necessary. Like this isn't just a talk for just abstract ideas. Like this is something I really hope that as a church we put into practice, because it's so vital to the life of the church. We need intimate relationships, where we can be challenged to grow, because on our own we will come and go to things as we have time, as we're free, right? But if there's no accountability in place, we will sort of just wander off on our own. But we need others who will actually care for us, love us, and lead us to Jesus, and even be willing to point out when we're falling astray. We need accountability.
Wow, what a word of exhortation that we got today. But thank you so much for spending some time with us and listening to this discussion. We hope that it was helpful for you, that you were able to get something from it, and that you were able to apply some of what we talked about today, especially. We are, again, Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philadelphia. If you're new here, go check us out at philly.gracecovenant.net. And do join us on Sundays for services where we're going through the miracles of Jesus, the sermon series. Thank you all again for spending some time with us today, and we will see you next time.